This is Ken Rockwell with KenRockwell.com and KenRockwell.tv. Let's give a look at Fujifilm's newest X-Pro3 digital camera. Well, I say that it's digital, but how do we know? You really don't. I mean, this looks like a film camera. That's the beauty of this. There's no conventional rear LCD. This is a camera, so you can go out and shoot it and not look like an idiot looking at the back of your screen all the time. It has an electronic finder. You can do playback and movies and magnifications and everything through the eyepiece. You don't ever need to look at an LCD on the back. So Fujifilm cleverly put a fake film box. This little LCD display is visible in any light. There's no backlight. You can see this in daylight or dim light, and it depends also a lot on how the angle of your light hits it. It's not really like a piece of paper, but it looks like a 120 film box. Of course, seasoned professionals look at this and say, yeah, you're kidding. It's not really 120. This would be a 35 millimeter size camera. It doesn't matter. If you really do need an LCD, and I don't know why you would, it flips down. There's no way to rotate this around to get it on the back of your camera to use this conventionally. This is a camera for seasoned professionals who don't need to look at an LCD on the back of their camera, and that's the way this camera is designed. That's its biggest claim to fame. Its other big claim to fame is the fact that it has a combined optical and electronic viewfinder. It's a work of art. You look through this, you can see a conventional optical finder view, as I'm showing here now, or you can look at it in its usual conventional electronic viewfinder. Let's take a quick look at some of the pictures I can make with this. This is primarily a people camera. It's not a nature and landscape camera, which is mostly what I shoot. Here is running water, captured as a still photograph, of course. And yet another palm tree. Hopefully you're viewing this in true 4K, which looks absolutely magnificent. However, the only way to see true 4K on a Macintosh, as I use, is you have to use the Chrome browser on a Macintosh computer to get to YouTube, and then you can see it in true 4K. Presume you've got a true 4K monitor plugged into your Macintosh. I am absolutely astounded that Fujifilm actually went to the trouble of making a camera with a fake film box end. Now, you can get this to show just regular data as well as the film box end, but I like to leave it on the film box end. This otherwise is just the same as all of Fuji's other interchangeable lens cameras. There's no mysteries to that. It uses all the same lenses, has all the same performance. It has the same sensor as the X-T30 and the X-T3 and takes exactly the same images, which are otherwise indistinguishable. What makes this camera nice is it has real metal dials like all the Fujifilm cameras. If you want to control these electronically, you can set this to the C position and control exposure compensation in the camera, which I wouldn't do. The ISO dial is peculiar. What's really nice is it has a marking in a visible size for every single ISO position for every third of a stop of ISO. I've never seen another camera do this in recent time, or at least no film camera that can do this. The one severe flaw is you're missing the ISOs you need. The low ISOs, 80, 100, and 125 are gone, as well as 25,600 and 51,200 are gone. The only way to get to them are through the menu. So the point of this dial is I think it's foolish. If I built this, I would only have full stops here and include all the high and low ranges. So honestly, I don't use this dial. I set it to C, which stands for camera or command, and then I control it using this front dial to set all of my ISOs, and I don't have any of them locked out. Otherwise, I'll just leave it on auto. But that's your choice. The dial locks at the A position, gives full range through here, and again comes back and locks at the A position. The time exposure setting lets you set the time. You can actually set it out to 15 minutes. It's not a conventional time exposure. It's just the crazy way Fuji labels it, but you can go out to a straight 15 minutes. X-Sync for flash is 250th, which is excellent as cameras go. Overall, I find this camera, it's a people camera. All the Fujifilm digital cameras have been people cameras. Shooting straight out of the camera's JPEGs, the colors are more muted, the contrasts are more reasonable. It's almost as if the cameras are in permanent portrait mode. To get the really wild and vivid colors that I favor for my work, I prefer other brands of cameras, or possibly if you would shoot this camera in RAW. And that's what I think is funny when people ask me, gee, Ken, how's this camera compared to a Canon or a Nikon or a Sony? The answer is, for those of us who've been shooting, and I've been shooting for over 50 years, the answer is each brand of camera looks completely different. Now, if you don't really care how your pictures look, you could worry about the technology and pixels, but for those of us who actually care how our work looks, for nature landscape, Canon and Nikon are my favorites. For people, Fuji is the way to go. To be honest, Sony is the way to go for sports. Their autofocus system is unmatched. It's faster and better for the most part than anything from Fuji or Canon or Nikon, which still are a bit slower than the digital single lens reflexes they all make. I'll also admit that I've been shooting Fuji Velvia film since 1990 when it first came out in every possible format. I've owned every one of the X100 series from the X100 of 2010 up through today's X100F. I also have an XT30, all of which I love. This is not my favorite camera in the series simply because it's bigger. It's pretty darn big. If I was going to shoot one of the bigger cameras, I'd shoot maybe the XH1. And I'm not a fan of the optical finder for cameras with interchangeable lenses because this finder does not have the ability to change its magnification. So depending on which lens you're shooting, you're not usually getting the optimum view through the optical finder. So I always use the electronic finder. The advantage of the optical finder is zero delay for trying to shoot sports in action, but guess what? This isn't a camera for sports in action. And also, the electronic finder is so good, running it up to 200 frames per second, the amount of delay through the electronic finder has been addressed. I don't think I'd worry about that. This is a camera for people who appreciate the finest things in life. It's extremely well made. These top and bottom covers are made from titanium. These are all metal. The buttons are metal. The shutter button's metal. It has a real thread for real threaded cable release. This is a beautiful camera. The biggest flaw mechanically is this crappy little flap. The older version of this, as well as my XT30, has a real hinge here, much nicer than Nikon or Canon with their crappy little flaps. But it looks better. It's a little classier than most crappy flaps, which are made entirely of crappy flap material. This has a stiffer material in the back, which looks really well, and it doesn't fall out now. And it is easy to get to, but it's still a step down from what the previous model was. To charge it, I charge it by USB-C. Something missing is there's no more a four-way rear controller. You have to do everything with this thumb nubbin. The older X-Pro3 had a four-way controller as well as this thumb nub, and I think that's a mistake. You can control things using touch functions, and I have a whole video on that. The problem is touch functions don't work on the little baby screen. They only work on the big screen. And are you really going to knock this down like that to make a touch function? No. So to be honest, for a lot of the settings you'd have to get to, you can't get to with this. But again, this is a camera for seasoned masters, not for people who have to change their settings between every photograph. If you know what you're doing, that's for whom this camera is designed. Another nice thing about how well this camera is made is it's still made with pride domestically in Japan. The optical finder compared to the X-Pro3, it has a fixed magnification of 0.52 times, which is a fairly small optical finder. It only works out to a 23 millimeter, which is a 35 millimeter equivalent lens. And beyond that, it just shows you question marks because it can't see beyond that. It's a small finder. The X-Pro3 had a swapping 0.6 or 0.36 times magnification through its optical finder, which I prefer. But as I said, personally, I'm not an optical finder kind of guy for interchangeable lens cameras. And that's the beauty of Fuji. Unlike Nikon or Canon or Sony that only make the same cameras with a fixed electronic finder, with Fuji, you can get your choice of a combined optical electronic finder, or like most cameras, just an electronic finder, or they also make cameras that have no finder at all and you're just using your back LCD. I really love that about Fujifilm because you have such a broad range of choices. Something that I miss is there's no built-in flash, and Fuji has for a while included a free magical little flip-up flash with some of their other nicer cameras. This has none of that, so you're on your own. And to be honest, I think flash is a very critical part for fill flash for most of my work in almost every kind of light, and I really miss that with this camera. But as I said, this is a camera for people who just the joy of photography is everything, and owning a fine camera. These are all metal. These dials, these buttons, these are actually all metal. Lesser cameras make them out of plastic. Not this. This is metal, that's metal, this lever's metal, it's plastic on all the other cameras. The only thing plastic, I think, are these 5 buttons. These 5 push buttons are plastic, and this nubbin is plastic, and maybe these 2 buttons here. But all these other buttons are actually metal. In other words, as this camera ages and you use this for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, this will all show the patina of use by the master. Watch out. If you're going to use this on a tripod, which doesn't really seem like a tripod kind of camera, that's the GFX medium format cameras, oftentimes you won't be able to fold this down more than 90 degrees. So don't expect to have it on a tripod looking like this because you will probably run out of room. In other words, there's where the tripod hole is. And when you try to fold this down, there's not a lot of room for getting your tripod head in there. I find it odd that the play button isn't actually marked with an icon. It's just marked play, so you have to stop and read this. With time, again, the master becomes one with his camera, and he will just know exactly where the play button is. But starting to use this camera, it's a little hard to find. It's also hard to find by feel. These particular buttons are very flush to the camera, so it's not that clear, and forget about it if you're wearing gloves, finding which of these does which. High ISO performance is superb. It's exactly the same as the XT30, and here are some samples. First, let's look at the overall full image. What I like is the fact that the image doesn't change at all as one goes up in ISO. You can choose any of your ISOs within reason, get the same looking picture. ISO 80, which is the pull. Admittedly, some people worry like, oh, I won't get as much highlight dynamic range. Well, we professionals call that added highlight contrast, which depending on what you're trying to do, for instance, shooting on a dull day, will spark up the highlights a little bit. Even ISO 100 is a pull ISO, so to speak. Its native ISO is 160. And as we go up through all the ISOs, everything at a normal size here, you're seeing things. This is the full frame. You're seeing the full frame here. Things look pretty much the same until you get to the very high ISOs. And you can see what they're doing. It's only here at the very highest ISOs where things start to get a little bit mottled or maybe a little bit redder in these cameras. Now let's look at the details. Let's look at a crop. This represents 1/10 of the horizontal width of the image. So in other words, as you're looking at these crops, imagine the final image being 10 times wider than your screen. And ask yourself, an image this big, would you ever really get this close? The answer is no, of course not. So what you'll see primarily, and all cameras do this, as ISOs go higher, is you lose details. You lose the fine details and the fine texture. Strong lines will stay, but the noise reduction is working triple overtime to scrub away all the finer things going on along with the noise. In other words, it can't really tell the difference between a detail and a noise. It'll leave the sharp edges alone because they correlate up and down or left and right, but just random textures like wood grain, it gets lost. And as the ISOs climb, those things get lost. Mostly the most obvious thing when you're new to this is look at the fine filigree things in between the numbers on the clock. You'll see how those quickly go away. And it's only when we get to very highest ISO, 51,200, which is completely insane, where you see we've pretty much lost it and can barely see the numbers. And that's perfectly normal. This is actually excellent performance. Cameras used to never be anywhere near this good. And that's essentially it. For the details, you can click the link and go to my complete written online reviews along with sample images that you can download and look at the files to see them exactly how good they'll look at the various ISOs. Thanks for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.tv, and kenrockwell.com.